Hello everyone, Stepan here. With this video I'm going to start a series on the French defense, and this will be a video in which we cover all the basics, the main variations and the basics of all the main variations, opening ideas for both sides, and commonly what's the plan for black and what's the plan for white in the French defense. Now mind that each variation will be covered in detail in the separate video, and I'm not going to go too much in depth into each one here. In the description below you can find the detailed branching of every variation, and what you see on your screen now will be explained in more detail in the description, and you can also find the timings to each exact variation if you are not interested in all of them. So let's get going. First of all, the French defense starts after white plays pawn to e4 and black plays e6. Now it could happen that on move 1 white plays d4, you play e6, and then white plays e4. That would transpose to the French, but that rarely happens. To e6 there is barely only one option. I think Bobby Fischer used to play the move d3 in this position, getting out of the French, and that would usually transpose into the King's Indian attack. So no, we are not going to cover that in this video, but remember that if black plays e6, you have the option of avoiding the French still. But the main move and the most challenging way to fight the French is to play d4, and black will play d5, and this is what always happens. Now, first of all, let me cover a bit of the history, and the French defense got popular in the early 20th century. The first time it was officially known as a defense, and even though it was played before, was in a match played between London and Paris in 1834, so in the first half of the 19th century. And during the match, one player from the French side called Chamouilly actually forced his teammates to play the French defense, and that's when it was adopted. After that, there have been a few big names which helped develop the theory, namely, first of all, Giza Marozzi, the guy who named the Marozzi bind. After him, Mikhail Botivnik, Petrosyan, and many other strong players, especially Soviet players. And in the modern age, some of the main exponents of the French have been Gata Kamsky, Morozevich, Varuzian Akobian, and many others, but those three namely. So if you would like to study the French defense, the best way is to start with the games of players who have helped develop the theory, and I will write down the names in the description below so you can check them out. Now, to start with the French defense, I would like to get to this position. This is a position in the advanced French. Once again, I'm going to cover the opening moves in detail later, but just to explain the most important factor of the French defense, which is the pawn structure. And if you get all the pieces of the board from this position, this is the normal pawn structure in the French, which both sides have to work with. Now immediately you can see the downsides. The main problem for black in the French defense, which you must have heard before, is the French defense bishop, which is stuck on c8. You can already see that its scope isn't that good and that it's only controlling one square, and the problem for black is that it can happen very often that the bishop stays that way throughout the game, and your main issue in the opening will be how to activate this bishop. Now considering the pawn structure. When you look at a pawn structure, you always need to see in which direction one side's pawns are facing. Of course, in this case, black's pawns are facing to the queen side and white's pawns are facing to the king side. So a general rule is, even though it shouldn't always be followed, is that you plan your attack on the side at which your pawns are facing. That means that in this position, black is most commonly going to strike on the queen side, white is going to strike on the king side, and your pawns which are facing that way will easily provide support than if, let's say, black tries to attack on the king side, which is pretty hard in this position, while advancing on the queen side seems pretty natural in this position. So this is the main idea. Now, since the French defense is a defense, I'm going to cover black's plans first. Now, as I said, you have a problem bishop on c8. Secondly, you need to find a way to break up the position. White, of course, has two advanced pawns on e5 and on d4. Once again, it doesn't have to be this way. This is just what happens after the advanced French defense, where white plays the move pawn to e5 on move 3. But this is generally the basic pawn structure you will get from the French. Now, in order to break up white's pawn structure, you have two options, and you have two pawn breaks. One of them is c7, c5, which is the most common one, and the second one is f7, f6. Now, each pawn break is pretty different. With f7, f6 you are striking at the top of the pawn structure, and with c5 you are striking at the base of the pawn chain, and you are disrupting the defense of d4 by weakening the pawn on c3. You are disrupting the defense by weakening the pawn on d4. And if white doesn't react, if he doesn't defend, if he lets, for example, you take and he recaptures with the piece, then the e5 pawn is terminally weak. So these are your main ideas. In each and every variation of the French, you are going to be looking for these two pawn breaks. This is the main plan for black. I would just like to highlight first, if you are a seasoned French defense player, this is a video on the basics, so you might not find too much here, but I will make a video on each separate variation, so you will get something that way, I hope. Now, these are the plan for black. Resolve the issue of your bad bishop on c8 and find the pawn break, either c5 or f6. And this will usually happen early on in the opening. Now, on the other hand, what white is trying to do is he's trying to develop an attack on the king side. Now, that can be done in numerous ways, and each variation offers something else, but generally white's plan is to advance on the king side and strike through black's defenses and get to the king. This means that usually in the French defense, black is more likely to focus on a maneuvering game and developing, and white is immediately going to try and get his opening edge by attacking and starting an even greater space gain in the center and on the king side. Now let's go over the variations. After the move d4 and d5 by black, white has three main options and one passive option. The first option is the move knight to c3. This is by far the most commonly played move. It's called the Paulsen variation of the French. Mind you, it's only the Paulsen if black doesn't change the variation, which we will go through later, but this is the most common idea. And now black has several responses to that. Once again, I'm going to go into each variation in detail separately. I'm just going to give you a brief analysis in this video. The first and the most popular continuation is the move bishop to b4, and this is now the Winawer French, and for a long time this was considered the best way for black to face the French defense. Now the position normally continues with pawn to e5, expanding in the center. Now you can notice the pawn structure we were discussing earlier on, and the pawn break black has, which is c5, which he plays immediately weakening white's center and exploiting the fact that the knight is now on c3, so the move c3 supporting d4 isn't possible. In this position, white thus has to provoke black into doing something so he can be able to play c3 or get a pawn to c3. So the most common plan is to play a3, forcing the bishop to take. You have to take in this position. Moving away would be just a waste of tempo. So bishop c3, bc3. Now you can see that white has supported the d4 pawn, and he achieved his idea of supporting the center despite having a ruined pawn structure, you could argue, and having doubled pawns. But the move, even though it's doubled, is much more significant on the c3 square than on the b2 square. Now the game continues with knight to e7, most commonly for black. Of course, this is the logical square to develop to. Queen to g4, attacking the g7 pawn, and now this is the so-called poisoned pawn variation of the Winawer French, and black will have two responses. And once again, this is what you will most commonly get out of the Winawer. Of course, the game can branch out into several different sidelines, but I will cover them on the video on the Winawer French in detail. The first move for black here is of course castles, after which bishop to d3, knight b to c6, normal game. After queen to g4, black can also choose to play queen to c7, which is now accepting the sacrifice of a pawn. So queen takes g7, rook to g8, queen h7, c takes d4, opening up the center, and you can see immediately that in this position, white has 7 pawns. Black doesn't have 7 pawns; he has 6. And after rook to g8, knight to e2, white can't, of course, take back on d4 because queen takes c2. So after knight to e2, knight b to c6 developing, f4, bishop to d7, These are the normal plans for both sides, and this is what you will normally get. And now you can see that black still has a problematic bishop now on d7, but he at least managed to develop it somehow. He has an active rook, although it's one pawn down. Black has a lot of initiative in this position and great attacking chances. So this is the poison pawn variation of the Winawer. Once again, every other variation will be covered later on. After knight to c3, the second most common way for black to play is the move knight to f6. And this variation is called the classical variation of the French defense, and this was the first variation that was played, and this was thought to be the best way for black to fight. Now from this position on, white has two options. The first option is bishop to g5 pinning the knight, which is the Burn variation, to which black will respond with d4, knight takes e4, bishop to e7, of course he has to support the f6 knight, bishop takes, and now g takes. You are not going to give up your dark squared bishop, you need it in the attack, and you have the open g file to work with. White will most commonly continue with knight to f3, castle queenside, and black will castle queenside as well. Now the second option, after bishop to b4, is the move e5. Is the move e5. And this variation is called the Steinitz variation of the French defense, and this is one of the most fighting ways for black to play. Now the position would continue with knight f to d7. Of course he has to move away. Now the point of this maneuver, even though it seems like black is wasting time, is that he will have a comfortable time playing f6, opening up the position, and even striking with c5 if he wants to close down the position. Now if you remember, I have made a series on the Caro-Kann defense, you can check that out as well, but there's a variation called the Advance Caro-Kann, in which the only difference from this position is that this bishop, which is now on c8, is on f5. So the Advance Caro-Kann is the improved Advance French, or this Steinitz variation of the French. And in this position, black would love to have the bishop on f5, but the plans are the same. Your plan is either to push f6 and castle queenside, or to push c5 and castle kingside, which is much safer. Now the game would continue with f4, c5, knight to f3, knight to c6, bishop e3, a6, and you can see that both sides are going on with their plans, following the pawn structure and getting a normal attack flow. Of course, white is expanding on the king side, black is expanding on the queen side. Now let's go back. If not bishop to b4 or move 3 by black, which is the Winawer, if not knight to f6, which is the classical, black can go for d takes e4 on move 3 after the move knight to c3, and this is called the Rubinstein variation. And this isn't such a fighting way to play. I believe that black is losing a lot of his chances with this variation, and we have knight takes e4, knight to d7, knight to f3, knight gf6, knight takes, and this now, if you remember the Caro-Kann defense, or if you know the Caro-Kann defense, looks a lot similar. Instead of having the pawn on c7, the only difference is that black has a pawn on c6, so he is much faster to stop the move d5, and in this position it's actually a threat. So this is what you get out of the Rubinstein. After knight to c3, there is one more option for black, and that's knight to c6. And this is the least commonly played variation nowadays. It's continuing the classical variation of the French defense, and the game is far too passive, and that's why this isn't so popular anymore. Knight to f3, knight f6, e5, knight e4. And from this position on, of course, white can take, but it's not that advisable because you have to dislodge your f3 knight. And this isn't as popular, but perhaps it could be a great surprise weapon to surprise your opponents. Now let's go back. After e4, e6, d4, d5, we just covered knight to c3 and the main variations which branch out from that. After d5, the second most common plan, and what I believe is the most fighting way to face the French, is the Tarrasch French, and that's the move knight to d2. And with this move, the basic idea, the basic opening idea behind knight to d2 is that you are able to play c2, c3, defending your d4 pawn without having to wreck your queenside pawn structure. Now white has several responses. White has three moves he could play. The best way for black to continue out of the Tarrasch French is to play knight to f6, and of course this is now provoking the move e5, and you will get the same plans as in the knight to c3 lines. e5, knight f to d7, bishop to d3 developing, c5, c3 defending, knight to c6, knight to e2 adding support to the d4 pawn, adding support to the c3 pawn, and also what's most important, you aren't developing to to the square f3 because you are planning to play the move f4, and if black should continue putting on pressure on d4, you are able to place your d knight on f3 and thus have 1, 2, 3, 4 defenders on d4. So your main idea is to defend the d4 pawn. Now black continues with cd4, cd4, and now black has several options. As I said, the move queen to b6 has to be reacted to with knight d to f3. You are defending the d4 pawn. And of course, if black had castled already, then you don't have to defend, because if he takes, he takes with the queen, you play bishop to h7 check, and you take the queen, which is now on d4. This is a common trap you have to remember if you are black. But the most common line after cd4 is for black to play f6. And now white has two ways to respond. My favorite idea in the Tarrasch French for white is this attack that I'm going to show you now. And you play the move knight to f4. And this is a very aggressive line in which you win an exchange, but black has monster center pawns, which can often lead to trouble for white. The game continues with knight takes d4. Of course, black has to take the central pawn, which he was just offered. And you don't take anything, you play queen to h5 check. And this is actually the main line of the Tarrasch now. After queen to h5 check, there is no good way for black to defend with the pawn, because if g6, then knight takes g6, or even bishop g6 check. So he plays king to e7. Now you take e takes f6, knight takes f6, you play knight to g6, exploiting this pin, and black has to take, h takes, queen takes. You have just won an exchange for a pawn. However, these two central pawns almost compensate for that, and if you ask the engines, black is slightly better here despite being material down. So this is a very fighting way for white to play, and I would advise this variation if you are trying to have fun while playing chess. This is, I think, the most fun variation of the French. But after f6, if you'd like to have a more normal game, then you just take with e takes, knight takes, and now you have given black what he wanted. You weakened the d4 pawn. You have given him an option to open up the bishop, even if it should cost him a pawn with d5. Of course, in this position is still defended, and this is the main line of the Tarrasch. So after knight to d2, white continuing with knight to f6. You force the knight away. Knight fd7, bishop to d3 developing, c5, c3, you have to defend with the pawn, knight to c6. Now you play knight to e2 to make sure you can play knight d f3, and to make sure you can play f4 at your own leisure, and to make sure you can play knight to f4 if black plays f6. Now after knight to d2, there are two more ways for black to respond. He can play c5, which is another variation of the Tarrasch, and to this you take the pawn, e d5, queen d5. He can also take with the e pawn. Both variations are good, but queen d5 is more challenging. And now you give up your pawn temporarily. You play knight g to f3, c takes d4. Of course, now you can't capture, but you play bishop to c4, and after queen to d6, you can increase the pressure on the pawn by playing knight to b3. You can castle. You will get your pawn eventually, don't worry. But this is another line that black could go for, so we have to be prepared. Once again, this variation alone will be covered in a separate video, so we will have a detailed knowledge of every single one. Now I'm just going over the basics. After knight to d2, the third most common way for black to play is d takes e4, but this is a slightly more passive variation, because after knight e4, knight to d7, of course black doesn't want to play knight f6 immediately, because you will capture with the knight. He prepares that, so knight f3, knight g f6, knight takes, knight takes. Now once again, if the pawn was on c6, this would be the Caro-Kann defense, but the pawn is on c7, so this is the French, but the positions often transpose. So this was the Tarrasch French. After the moves d4, d5, white has two more options. Perhaps even the most active way for white to challenge the French defense, if you asked the engines and top grandmasters, is the move e5, which is the advanced variation. And with this move, white is simply gaining space as soon as possible, and after the c5 move is provoked, he can still play c3, defending with the pawn, as the same as when he played knight to d2. Only this way he already gained space in the center, so black doesn't have that many options. First of all, he can't develop the knight to f6. Now the game continues with c6, knight to c6, knight to f3, normal development, and you can once again see the pawn chains, see the plans of attack for both sides. Black is crashing through on the queen side, white is doing the same on the king side. And the last variation, which I will be covering, is after the move d5 for white to simply exchange the pawns. And after ed5, ed5, this is now the exchange French defense. And it can often be quite dull. This is considered as to be one of the most boring opening choices for white, and many people actually try to stay away from players who play the exchange French because it just doesn't give that much, and the games are often draws and often boring. But there was a game played recently by Magnus Carlsen in the Pro Chess League when he managed to use his positional advantages and the fact that he is a tempo up to great effect, and he used the exchange French to win several games. So of course this is a great weapon if you are strong positionally, but if you would like some fireworks and exciting chess, don't play the exchange French. But once again, it will be covered in detail in a separate video. Okay, I went through all of the main variations of the French. I hope you managed to understand the basic ideas for both sides, and that you learned something about the French defense. If you have never played the opening, I hope you will try. If you have, I hope you got something new. And stay tuned for more chess. Thanks very much for watching, and the series on the French is coming up. Bye. Thanks.